There's an expression in the South Carolina Low Country that defines time as Sundays a-comin' and Sundays a-goin'. And I thought I would catch you up on my goings and a-comings since we were last together. It's been a year, yeah. It's kind of hard to believe. But I can tell you, I spent a solid year of writing and editing, and this was actually the culmination of many years of working on the books of Ruth and Esther that you have heard often about. So I thought I would show you what came in the mail last week.
We're going to fix that.
Okay. And this is it, my commentary. So I will show you. Finally, I have to admit, the secretary walked into my office with this big box and thinking, what is she bringing in here? Dixon often orders wine and has it delivered to the school. I thought, well, that's a little much, but it wasn't wine. It was my commentary. So we're very excited to have this finished. I spent the summer in Innsbruck, Austria, as I've done a number of summers. Remarkable time to be in Europe. I wanted to see firsthand what's going on, and I have to admit it's unnerving. But it's unnerving here too. So, and my comings, I'm getting ready for a trip to Italy and Greece with students January 2nd. So we're working on that course now, a colleague and I. More immediately, it's homecoming at Stetson this weekend. So it's been kind of an exciting time to see students return. But last night, we had a celebration of a colleague who's taught at Stetson for 57 years. His name is T. Wayne Bailey. And if you're a Democrat, you've heard of T. Wayne Bailey. Yes, but Dr. Bailey is absolutely remarkable. He started political science at Stetson. The room last night was filled with students from across the decades, and quite a few dignitaries, elected people. We were bipartisan last night with John Micah, Bill Nelson, and the Honorable Justice, Florida Supreme Court Justice James Perry, who will be retiring this year. And James Perry is a remarkable story in his own right. Grew up in the projects of North Carolina, sued the state of Georgia because no African American was allowed to pass the bar. You could sit the bar, but no one ever passed. And so that racism was exposed. He's been an incredible voice for justice in this state. And since my daughter clerked for him, I'm particularly fond of Justice Perry. Even more immediate right now, I'm working on the College of Arts and Sciences Tenure and Promotion Committee. That's a big deal for colleagues, and we have a time frame, a window that we get these massive files, portfolios, and we have to turn them around, which is the reason I can't stay for lunch today, because I'm chairing that committee and our deadline is this week. So it's always kind of crunch time for us. But I am so very glad to be here and to see Lloyd and Lori here. I really had thought when I was coming, because I knew that, well, actually, Laura, you had told me that they had moved to Palm Coast, and I kept thinking I'm going to be there and they're not going to be here this time, and that's going to really feel different. And then I turn around and there is Lloyd. So perfect. All right. The power of forgiveness. Just over a month ago, the beginning of October, I think it was October the 2nd, I got up on that Sunday morning and I did what I do every day, which is to check the major news feeds. Now, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I want to make sure, nothing drastic has gone on in the world while we have slept. That particular morning, CNN was reporting that a 6-year-old boy wounded during a shooting at a South Carolina elementary school that first week in October had died. And the news had originated from a Facebook posting by his mother. Jacob Hall, little 6-year-old Jacob Hall, was hit in a femoral artery, and a massive blood loss led to major brain injury. Do you remember this one? This was up in the upper part of South Carolina, up near Anderson, Seneca, that area. Yes. And so his mother, and it was a teenager who showed up on the school grounds, shot a couple of kids. Yeah. He was caught. And what Renee Hall, the mother of young Jacob, wrote was, "You are dead to me by God, and you are dead to me by God. You are my angel. And now, as I lay here and watch the life leave your body, it reminds me of how honored I was to have you in my life." A family statement added, "Thanks to doctors and the community." It said Jacob was an example of pure love. He showed us how to love, laugh, and smile, even on days we did not want to, his mother and father said. God gave him to us, and he was taken away from us by a senseless act. We know that Jacob has already forgiven this child for what he did to him and his family, because that's the kind of child Jacob was. So here's a mom saying, "I forgive the 14-year-old child who took my son." A headline this morning said that Tracy Morgan, the comedian actor, has forgiven the Walmart driver who T-boned him on the Conan show. Thinking about forgiveness. This is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 18, from the Cotton Patch Gospel. Yeah. Then Rock sidled up and asked, "Sir, how often should I forgive my brother when he keeps doing me wrong? 7 times? I wouldn't say 7 times, Jesus replied, but 70 times 7. That's why the God movement is like a big businessman who wanted to settle the accounts of his customers. As he started to do so, one customer came in who owed a bill of more than $10,000. He had nothing to pay on the account, so the businessman told the sheriff to put up for sale everything the guy had and apply it to the debt. But the fellow did a song and dance. "Please give me some more time and I'll pay every cent," he begged. The businessman was touched by the guy's pitiful pleadings, so he let him go and marked off the debt. Then that same guy went out and found a man who owed him $100. Grabbing him round the neck, he choked him and said, "Pay me that money you owe." "Please give me a little more time," the man begged, "and I'll pay every cent." But he refused, and instead he swore out a warrant for him. When the little man's friends found out about it, they were really upset. So they went and told the big businessman all that had happened. Then the big businessman sent for the guy who had owed him the huge debt and said to him, "You low-down bum. I marked off all that debt for you because you begged me to. Shouldn't you then have been kind to that little man just as I was kind to you?" Still hot under the collar, he turned the fellow over to the law to be thrown into the clink until every last dime of the debt had been paid. And my spiritual father would treat you along the same lines. unless every single one of you forgives your brother and sister from your heart. So Peter, he's the rock in this story, asked Jesus, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Jesus said, not 7 times, 77 times. So that's not 77, that's 70 times 7. That sounds a bit much to me. How about for you? Jesus tells this parable about a king and a slave who owes the king more than a slave could ever repay. And the king orders that the man be sold together with his wife and children and all his possessions so payment could be made. And all of that was according to the law, not just some secular law, but religious law, biblical law. The slave falls to his feet, to his knees, saying, have patience with me. Have patience with me. I will pay you everything. Now note, there's no declaration of bankruptcy where the lenders or workers get stiffed. It's, give me time and I'll pay you every dime. The king had pity, or we might say compassion. He released the slave, forgave him the debt, and that is a great ending to a story. Only the story didn't end there. The slave runs into another slave who owes him only a tenth of what he himself had owed the king. He grabs the fellow slave by the throat and he demands payment immediately. When the fellow slave or servant asks for patience, a little more time to pay the debt, the man has him thrown into prison until he can pay the debt. Now, our minds are all over this. And we're probably thinking along the lines of the man's friends who are outraged at what has happened. Maybe part of their reaction and our reaction might be, if it happened to him, it could happen to us. But it's also a matter of injustice. Shouldn't forgiveness be passed around? The way we heard it this morning first was by Clarence Jordan in the vernacular of the red clay fields of South Georgia. And Kathy, I have to tell you, I love your accent. So, Clarence Jordan, we've talked of him before when I've been here, a farmer and New Testament Greek scholar, was the founder of Koinonia Farm, a small but influential religious community in southwest Georgia. And Clarence Jordan was the author of the Cabbage Patch Gospel, or Cotton Patch paraphrase of the New Testament. As a young man, he was born in 1912. As a young man, his family had wanted him to study law. But instead, he felt a call to the ministry, and he went to the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. And there, he immediately showed a proclivity for Greek. He absolutely mastered the study of the New Testament, and he earned a PhD in Greek. Clarence Jordan could have gone anywhere in 1938. He could have made his mark as a scholar. but he went back home to Americus, Georgia, because he believed that the roots of poverty were not just economic, but spiritual. There, he and his wife Florence, with another couple, began an interracial farming community. Blacks and whites worked together and sat down together to eat. Now, this was simply more than the good old boys and the good old girls of South Georgia could take. It just really looked too socialist for the 50s and 60s. And so they boycotted the farming products of Koinonia Farm, their vegetable stands. In fact, they bombed. They blew up their vegetable stands. The white citizens of Sumter County, Georgia, refused to buy their products, and the merchants of the town refused to sell them goods, such as fertilizer and seeds and anything else that farming community needed. So there were bombings and drive-by shootings, verbal threats that turned violent. Clarence Jordan even appealed to the President of the United States because it had become so dangerous for the community. He appealed to then President Eisenhower. The President turned it over to the Governor of Georgia, who turned the matter over to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to look into what these perhaps communist or communist sympathizers and their partners were doing. Such radical lifestyles that treated blacks as equal was seen as an affront to status quo white supremacy. When their vegetable stands were bombed, you know what they did? They found something else. They started selling pecans, or pecans if you know it that way, and shipping them across the nation. Anybody ever bought pecans from Koinonia Farm? There you go. The community never responded to violence with violence. When Jordan died in 1969 unexpectedly in his little writing cabin there on the farm, the local coroner sent his body home naked. He did everything he could do to shame Clarence Jordan, not just in life but in death. And the local funeral home refused to embalm the body. That could have been the end. Only Koinonia did not die. And I hope you know the continuance of this story. Linda and Millard Fuller had arrived in those later years while Jordan was still there, wanting a different way of life than the one that privilege and wealth had provided them. And it was there at Koinonia, as they shared the gospel and meals with Jordan and the family of black and white neighbors, that Fuller dreamed his own dream of the gospel, where all are welcome at the table and live in racial harmony. For out of violence and inequality and a spirit of forgiveness, Habitat for Humanity was born. Much like when Nelson Mandela walked out of Robbins Prison after almost 30 years in jail and helped end apartheid and become president of South Africa. Much like so many people we have seen. It always kind of tickles me to think that Jordan's nephew was President Jimmy Carter's chief of staff. Remember him, Hamilton Jordan? And of course Jimmy Carter's connections to Habitat for Humanity. We just never know where acts of justice will lead. And rather than seeking revenge, to seek justice and offer forgiveness. Jesus tells another story about forgiveness. The parable of the prodigal son. It too has a second ending in the parable of the elder brother. Now we actually often tell these two together, but they really are separate parables that are linked. Only Luke tells it, and you know it. It's the younger boy, can't wait for daddy to be dead. He says, "Give me my inheritance now." And so the father does something. He takes all that he has, takes what is his, and he divides it in half, because they're two brothers, the younger brother and the older brother. And he gives what he has, he divides it between the younger and the older. Of course, you know the story. The younger brother goes off into the far country. He has a great time partying, living large, until it's all gone. And of course, he ends up destitute. He has to work for somebody else. As the story goes, as Jesus tells it, he ends up taking care of another man's pigs and feeding them. Now, if you're Jewish and you just heard feeding pigs, you're going, how low can you go? And this is beyond shame and humiliation. And then the young guy starts to see, oh my word, the servants at my dad's home eat better than this. And the text says a really interesting thing. It says, and he came to his mind. It's a really important line. He came to his mind. We would say he came to his senses. He looked at himself. He saw who he was, and he recovered that former self. And he said, I'm going home and I'm going to beg my daddy to let me be one of his servants. And the text actually says that twice. Once he knows that, he decides it, he heads home. The father looks out one day. He sees this young man coming to him. Can you imagine how many times the father had looked down that road just hoping? You ever waited for your children to come? Yeah, even when you know they're coming, you get excited. And having a daughter who lives in Texas now, I got to tell you, it takes me days to calm down. I'm like a helium balloon. I'm so excited. But what if you think this is never going to happen, and the years pass? But the father looks down that road, and one day, here comes that figure toward him. And he can't control himself. He runs, he meets him. He takes a cloak and put on him the robe. He takes off his ring and puts it on his son's finger. Now what he just did by the giving of the ring, that's just not an expensive gift. That's welcome home. You're part of this family. You are family for us. And he has the fatted calf killed, and a party breaks out, a big party. The text says that the father had compassion. The younger son didn't even have to say, forgive me. The father had compassion and welcomed his son home, and there was a party. Suddenly the one who had placed himself outside family is brought in again. That's a great ending to a story. But just like the story that Matthew tells of the man being forgiven himself and then turning around and refusing to forgive another, this story has an ending, a second ending. The older brother. The older brother shows up, and he's watching this. Oh my goodness. Jealousy, rage, self-righteousness, everything builds in him. And he lashes out at his father. What are you doing? I stayed here all of those years. I'm the one who has served you. Now, what he failed to say is Daddy had given him his portion too. It wasn't like he hadn't gotten his cut. He had had his cut. And he says, look at him. He went off and he spent all of his money on whores. Of course, he doesn't talk about his own anger, his own failure to see that his father was waiting all these years for that son. He couldn't see his father's love for his brother. And of course, he himself had none. He even says, why didn't you ever give me a calf to entertain my friends? And so the text ends. There's a statement about, can't you see? Could you not see? Can you not see what forgiveness and love do? But the older brother can't see. And now the one who has stayed home is outside the party. And it was the lack of forgiveness, being unable to forgive, that shut him out. I had a professor during my graduate school days. His name was George Buttrick. And Dr. Buttrick was known as the preacher of the 20th century. He in his 80s, he's Presbyterian, had a church in New York City, a really profound preacher. And in working with this text, he looked at the parable of the prodigal son and the elder brother. And he said that forgiveness without forgetting is not forgiveness. And he also said, in looking at the elder brother, he said, you know, we probably need to do a new listing of cardinal sins. All that stuff about adultery and fornication and all of that, Jesus always kind of just glides right over. Now, they're not said that it's the right thing to do, but it's kind of okay. Remember the woman caught in adultery? Remember that story? Caught in adultery, all the people bring her to Jesus, which we're always going, well, if she was caught in adultery, there had to be a man there too, okay? Only he's not brought, just her. And Jesus says, okay, go and sin no more. But we, as Buttrick pointed out, get all hung up on that and miss arrogance and pride and jealousy and unlove and self-righteousness and the sin of being unable to forgive. So each of these parables calls us to look at life and decide which part of the parable we will place ourselves. Forgiveness can radically change our world. Parents of a young boy taken in a senseless act of violence seek not eye for eye, but understanding. So where will we be? Will we join the party in celebration of forgiveness and reconciliation, or we place ourselves outside, being unable to forgive or to forget? Amen. During our discussion, we're going to talk about the role of the young man in coming to his mind. That's a really important part of the parable. Thank you.